Alright guys, Willem here, back with a new video. In this video I'll be doing something a bit abnormal for this channel, where usually on this channel I do retrospectives of entire games or seasons of television, sometimes movies, but I've never done a retrospective on one individual episode before. But this was an episode of TV that really was special to me when I was a kid, and one that I've watched dozens of times over the years, and that is the 10-year anniversary episode for Power Rangers Forever Red from Power Rangers Wild Force. An episode that does as much as it can to embrace the history of the show, bring back almost every Red Ranger at that point in the show's history, and again, an episode I just simply adore, and one I've over time been able to reanalyze. And while I definitely note a lot of its flaws, a lot of those flaws end up stemming from production issues, which we will obviously talk about here. But again, I just wanted to run through my thoughts on the episode 20 years after its initial airing, almost 5 years since I've even watched a single Power Ranger episode, which is part of the reason why I didn't fully know if I was going to end up making this video, where despite me being this massive Power Ranger fan as a kid, and me getting back to the series around the time of the 20th anniversary, which is somehow almost 10 years ago already, I've pretty much gone cold turkey on Power Rangers ever since the start of Ninja Steel, and now all these years later I decided to watch Forever Red once again, and I still adore a lot of what this episode does, and it's an extremely short 21-minute runtime, and still find this to be one of the most rewatchable episodes in the history of the series. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of the flaws of this episode does stem from production issues, with this season in Wild Force being made immediately after Disney had bought the rights to Power Rangers from Saban, despite not really wanting to do anything with it, with Wild Force initially intending to be the final season of the show. But Wild Force was already in development at the time that this purchase was made, and through that, Disney ends up being pretty hands-off in the production of this season, with this season initially intending to be the last season of the show. But Disney definitely rose an eye when they learned about the concept of doing another 2-part crossover episode that would obviously take a grander budget than your standard episode, immediately after having done the 2-part Time Force crossover in Reinforcements from the Future, which Disney was not pleased to learn about having to spend more money on a show that they don't care about, which severely reduced the scale of this episode, reducing it from a 2-parter to only 1 episode. Though interestingly, production decided to just say screw it and film the episode as if it was going to be a 2-parter anyway, with many of the scenes on the show being extended in their initial conception in the hopes that Disney would relent, but they end up having to be cut. But also with the filming of these extended scenes, it did lead to production running out of money before the end of production, leading to what is probably the episode's greatest flaw, but we will obviously talk about that later. But as expected, numerous ideas were thrown around for this episode. 4 known outlines exist, the first 2 involving these more generic villains that were described as 5 metallic warriors that would for some reason attack Earth, and specifically the various Red Rangers, leading to them teaming up by the end of the episode. And really, this concept just sounds kind of dumb, and thankfully they didn't go with that one. Now, the second outline did introduce more references to previous seasons, with the inclusion of Alpha 5 and Angel Grove, which was a step in the right direction, but still not entirely there yet. It wasn't until the involvement of Amit Balik, this Power Rangers superfan who had joined the writers team for Power Rangers Wild Force, having already written the previously mentioned Reinforcements from the Future, another old-time great Power Ranger episode, where he ends up creating his own draft that involves Andros gathering the Red Rangers to take down a cult, trying to resurrect Dark Spectre, and involve this grand final battle against Spectre himself, something that we never got to see in Space, which to me would have been the ideal story here, having this big bad return, especially one that, again, wasn't defeated by the Rangers themselves, only for the Rangers themselves to actually take them on here. But even beyond that, this would allow for the Rangers to interact more, as they would be gathered a lot earlier in the episode. And Balmic wanted to use this as a way to also retcon an explanation for Malagor, the villain in the Turbo movie, for why he has the same outfit as Dark Spectre, which would have been an interesting explanation there. But really, this plan did not go through, largely due to budgetary issues. And that's when we're left with the 4th outline, which ended up being really rushed together due to time constraints, and does mostly keep the ideals from the 3rd outline, though changes the villains and through that some of the context along the way. But with that, let's run through the episode itself, which just start with us obviously getting introduced to the premise of the entire episode by us starting off on the moon, where we do see the remnants of the Machine Empire digging up something And this is where we see this group of 5 metallic warriors, which was something brought back from the original drafts, though here they do make them the current heads of the Machine Empire. But weirdly, if you look at the costumes of the warriors themselves, you will recognize that these are costumes from Big Bad Beetleborgs, another Saban tokusatsu-based show that really becomes the main reason they switched the antagonist back from Dark Spectre, as they had these costumes lying around, and it would be much cheaper to use these Battleborg outfits for the villains here, which is also part of why this 5 metallic warrior concept was even something in those original drafts as well. So the fact that they return to that here ends up being a disappointing change, as again, I do feel like the other route with Dark Spectre was better, but one that doesn't really diminish the episode that radically, especially without knowing the context of what could have been here. But something cool that they did with the Beetleborgs here is that some of them are voiced by the actors of previous Rangers. The main antagonist here in General Venjix is voiced by Archie Cow, the guy that played Kai in Power Rangers Lost Galaxy, who would have been actually a decent get at this point, considering he did have a prominent role in CSI in this point in time. Also, 2 of the other generals are voiced by Walter Jones, who plays Zack, the original Black Ranger, and also Catherine Sutherland, who played Kat in Mighty Morphin through Turbo, which again is a nice little callback there. But during this scene, we do learn that the thing that they are digging up here is Serpentera, Lord Zedd's personal Zord that he at some point buried on the moon, which there are a lot of things in this episode that are not explained, largely due to the limited time frame they had to work with, and I do think that if they had bothered to explain everything, it would have kind of bogged down the episode, considering how much time they would have to use to do that. So again, I get why they didn't do that here, but again, there are many points throughout this episode where if you followed the continuity, you would be thinking, wait, when did that happen? Though Balmic himself has recognized these errors and does blame, obviously, the time constraints, and said that he would have later explained these if he had been able to follow up on them in Power Rangers Hexagon, which was his pitch for what would later become Ninja Storm, that, again, it would take way too long to fully explain all of that. Maybe for its own video down the road, but obviously it does end with a lot of things being unexplained over the course of this episode, though strangely, this one does actually have a real explanation for it that does call back to Scorpion Reign, this hoax within the Power Rangers fandom back in the 90s where someone claimed that a multi-part serial aired only in Australia that filled the gaps between Zeo and Turbo, with it showing the destruction of the Zeozords by the hands of Serpentera, which was laid to rest on the moon afterwards, which bizarrely it turns out that Balmic himself was involved in spreading these rumors and looked at these events as canon during the writing of this episode, despite the fact that, again, this was just a fan hoax, which explains why Serpentera is on the moon here, even though it technically never actually happens. But again, the return of Serpentera is a great callback here, and probably the next best thing for you to do with the antagonist here outside of that original Dark Spectre plan, especially considering you are now connecting the antagonists of 2 different seasons together, making it embrace more of the history of the show. And through this, we also get a pretty cool callback to it being refitted with a neoplutonium reactor to power it, which is a reference back to Zeo, where his material is mentioned to being the source of revived monsters' armors. But as the Machine Empire digs up Serpentera, we then cut to a familiar-looking, cloaked figure watching in the distance, weirdly cloaked in a position where his dark cloak actually makes him more easily spottable against the gray rocks, but it is obviously Andros, the Red Space Ranger, with this obviously being a homage to him wearing the same cloak in the original series, and this is obviously the first of the guest appearances that we end up seeing in this episode, where here he finds out about the Empire's plans, after having supposedly followed them for years, which seems extremely underwhelming, that he has spent literal years searching for them just for the entire conflict to end within 15 minutes in this episode. But Andros obviously ends up getting detected here, not by his cloak, but by him accidentally knocking down some rocks, which is super generic, but it does lead to a short chase sequence that for some reason has the Machine Empire riding after him on horses on the moon, so that's something. But Andros ends up escaping on his Galaxy Glider, another cool callback there. But then we cut back to Earth at a poolside restaurant, where we do get this short little cameo from Bulk and Skull, who I love that they bothered to bring them back here. And while it is just this one little scene of them having Bulk brag about having met Rita and Zed, only for Skull to obviously announce that he is as well, and like we see them playing chess using the Psycho Ranger chessboard that was a prop in space, which was a cool reference. But again, like, the scene ends up being extremely short here, though it was initially filmed to be longer with more references to previous seasons, but obviously had to be cut due to runtime. Though all this does make you question, how did Bulk get back to Earth, where the last time we had seen him was in Lost Galaxy, where he was left on Miranoi. So again, how did he get here? But it doesn't really matter. But they do end up picking up a call that is for a very special guest, which is where we see them being intimidated as they hand the phone over to a man lounging in a chair, who by voice alone, you can instantly recognize as Tommy. Obviously one of the most iconic Rangers of all time, who does look different here with shorter hair. But again, having Tommy back here and playing this role as mentor across this episode, as he orders the gathering of all the Red Rangers, making him feel like this Zordon figure, again, is a pretty great callback here and a pretty great development of his character, with him even having lines throughout the episode that were meant to be references back to Zordon. But even with Tommy here, there are things that were cut from this scene, where Tommy was meant to be the owner of this restaurant, and to actually not be aware of this entire situation with the Machine Empire until Andros calls him here. Though with the way that this scene is cut, it does end up implying that Tommy was already in the know and that he's actually the one behind all of this. Also, we do have a line from Tommy that was cut where he says that he's retired, which clearly was retconned moving forward, especially by the time of Dino Thunder. But then we cut to the Wild Force Rangers, who in a cut scene had just broken up a fight between two kids for some reason. But this is where Cole is approached by the next of our cameos in Carter Grayson, the Red Lightspeed Ranger, who I do love how this scene starts with Carter driving up in the rescue rover, another cool callback, but here Carter recruits Cole in the mission, saying that only Cole is necessary, which, why? I mean, the entire concept of this being a mission for only Red Rangers is never really explained, though there was a throwaway line that was cut out during this scene where Cole does mention that the others should stay behind to protect Turtle Cove, but that doesn't explain the other Ranger teams. And I know this initial concept of the Red Ranger team-up did stem from the Sentai version, where in their anniversary special of Gao Ranger vs. Super Sentai, it did contain a segment where all the Red Warriors showed up, so this obviously plays off of that. And again, it is a fantastic concept, but one that is still never fully explained. But again, who really cares? Again, it's a minor complaint that doesn't take anything away from the true quality of this episode. But then we cut to Nasada Spaceport, again another reference to the NASA ripoff from Turbo and In Space, but we see Carter and Cole arrive, and one by one, we get introduced to the other returning Rangers from Earth. First with the Silver Guardians in West, Time Force Red, and Eric, the Quantum Ranger, who Cole already knows, obviously, from the crossover that happened a few episodes ago. Now, I know the appearance of Eric here did lead to some controversy, as technically he is a 6th Ranger, not an official Red Ranger, but I do feel like Eric being here with West does make sense narratively, and considering that there can only be one Mighty Morphin Red Ranger, and they wanted 10 Rangers for this 10-year anniversary, and also production's good relationship with the Time Force cast, I do fully understand why they made this choice here to put Eric in. But then we get another cool introduction to TJ in a similar way to how Carter was introduced, where we first see the shot of his red car, which I believe is supposed to be Lightning Cruiser, though it doesn't really look like it. But either way, cool reference to him being the Red Turbo Ranger, and Carter even has to say his full legal name, which did seem like he struggled with saying it. Also here, we do get the camera like circling around TJ as he's introduced, which was another cool little touch there. And then we have TJ being the one to introduce Andros, which was a cool little moment there that implies their bond from being in the Space Rangers together. But then Andros announces that they've been assembled by a veteran ranger, the leader of the mission, and that's when Tommy obviously walks in, to which we have Cole asking who he is, and TJ awkwardly says he's the Red Zeo Ranger and he's a legend. But it does lead to Tommy telling them about why they've been gathered here, and that is because Andros has found the remnants of the Machine Empire, to which TJ says he thought the Zeo Rangers destroyed them years ago, and Tommy confirms that they only destroyed their leaders, which are weird lines considering the Zeo Rangers didn't defeat the Machine Empire. It was Rita and Zed that took them down at the end of Zeo, and they weren't fully destroyed until Countdown to Destruction, so again, none of this makes sense, but again, just a minor nitpick. But then he states that the mission is now to go to the moon, to which Cole is confused at how they'll get there, leading to Andros revealing the Astro Megaship Mark II, fresh off the construction yards of KO-35. Again, another cool set of references there especially after the original had been destroyed at the end of Lost Galaxy. But then we have Tommy asking them to join the mission, during which we do get some questionable acting from Cole, as he declares that he will do whatever it takes to save the Earth. Though obviously we then cut to the other Rangers, who vehemently declare their participation as well, leading to them walking towards the megaship until Andros mentions that there is another Red Ranger on Earth, to which Tommy says that he couldn't make it, only for us to hear the sounds of a motorcycle riding in, leading to the Rangers running outside to find that Jason has arrived, the original Red Mighty Morphin Power Ranger, a massive get for this episode, and he does get a great introduction here that can come off as kind of dickish, where he only calls Cole the new guy and ends up dismissing his handshake, but it does add to the coolness factor of his character. But also here, he does say that he recognizes some of the Red Rangers, particularly in him saying this to the Silver Guardians, which seems like a really random moment that is never followed up on in the episode. And then we see a short interaction between him and Tommy, with them shaking hands. An interesting moment considering the characters' extended backgrounds, but also the actors' rocky relationship, where they were known to have not gotten along back in the day. But then we get this like epic slow-mo shot as they walk towards the camera, leading to them boarding the megaship and taking off for the moon. Though with that, I do feel like we might as well talk about some of the questions that arise from this scene. First up is, how did certain Rangers get their powers back? Now, Andros, Carter, Wes, Eric, and Cole obviously still have their powers. Tommy didn't technically ever lose his Zeo powers on screen, though it does make you question why he never used them again, but whatever. But Jason and TJ are the big question marks here, as we explicitly see them losing their powers on screen. Now, I know that Balmic at one point claimed that Tommy got the powers back for them at some point through returning to Eltar, though I do know that there's also a comic that later retconned this to have Jason getting his power coin back himself through getting it from the Red Dark Ranger. And as for TJ, I think this one's like a bit more easy to explain, where you can imply that he got it back from Lightning Cruiser in a similar way to how Justin got his back from In Space. So again, there's like technical explanations for this, though none of them make the episode itself. Also, I might as well mention that the returning cast here has a glaring omission in Rocky, the second Mighty Morphin Red Ranger, whose actor Steve Cardenas was contacted and willing to reappear here, but he was in the process of moving by the time of filming, and they couldn't contact him in time. Though even then, even if he had been able to make the filming, he was only going to play a part in the final fight had Austin St. John said no, meaning in this scenario, where Austin St. John obviously is there, that means that we would have instead had Rocky as Tommy's butler, which is really demeaning to his character. Now, yes, I know that this is a reference to an episode of Power Rangers Zeo, but I do think it was probably better off that Rocky didn't appear here, as again, that would have just been a bad look for his character. Now, afterwards, we do get some transitionary scenes, including Venjix giving a speech about rebuilding the Machine Empire. We then also cut to Miranoi, where we see a shot of Leo pulling out the Quasar Saber, which I guess this is where I should mention Danny Slavin, Leo's actor's involvement in this episode, where he initially turned down the offer to return, largely due to a bad experience with production during Turkina's Revenge, but eventually he was convinced to reprise his role. However, that was after principal photography was already done, meaning all of his scenes were done in post, where you can very clearly see him being digitally inserted into group scenes, and through that, does cause some inconsistencies that we will talk about. But then we get a scene aboard the megaship where we do see a new Alpha robot, an Alpha 7, who doesn't get much to do here, but again, it's nice to see this reference and him also being voiced by Richard Stephen Horvitz, the original voice actor for Alpha 5. But the scene does start with Andros walking in, mentioning that he has contacted Leo and Aruko, the Red Aquitar Ranger, who is the only Ranger here that doesn't appear unmorphed, as they couldn't end up getting the original actor back, and instead he is voiced by the same guy that voiced Leo in Turkina's Revenge after Danny Slavin left the production of that, which does make me question, was the plan here to have both Aruko and Leo voiced by the same person, which I think that would have been hilarious. But this is where Tommy officially briefs the other Rangers on the mission, where Wes questions what are they looking for on the moon, and we get this great scene of Jason instantly knowing that they are digging up Serpentera, which leads to the Rangers building up the threat that Serpentera poses, and Cole saying that they have to stop them on the moon, which I guess this is the point where I should also mention that I really love the concept of this mission thematically. The fact that the Rangers are proactively heading to the moon here to bring the battle to the enemy instead of the typical Power Ranger formula of the enemies being based on the moon and sending the battle to Earth. So I did like this intentional contrast that this episode ends up bringing to the standard formula. But beyond this, most of the rest of the episode is non-stop fighting scenes, with said fighting scenes taking up about half of the episode, which can be underwhelming, as I obviously would have loved to see more character interactions, though again, with the limited amount of runtime that they had to work with, I feel like they did the best they can. But we do have the Rangers arriving on the moon, just as Venjix is informed that the improvements to Serpentera were complete, leading to a series of unmorphed fights with the Rangers and Cogs, that at this point in Power Rangers history, this was fantastic to see, these unmorphed fights that had slowly deteriorated over the course of the series, really ever since the end of the Zordon era. So it's nice to see that change, and thankfully the choreography here, and really throughout the entire episode, is really great as well, with each of the characters getting to showcase their unique fighting styles, with there being a funny contrast between most of the fights here that do obviously involve martial arts, but then we cut to Carter, who is just blasting away with his blaster, which, again, perfect choreography for his character. But after Cole's fight, we do see him chase down the generals as they are about to board Serpentera, but he gets blasted down only for him to be saved by the arrival of Leo and Aruko, riding in Leo's jet jammer. Now they obviously jump off to where Cole thanks them, leading to the rest of the Red Rangers catching up to them, and we for some reason have Leo demorphing just to give a single line, and for this to just be immediately followed up by with the morphing sequence. So again, seems pointless. And finally, if you do look at the initial group shot before the morphing sequence, Leo is still morphed, as obviously that would have made sense for him to never demorph here, but again, at the time of filming, they didn't know if Danny Slavin would be coming back, so they shot this scene with a morphed Leo. But then we have Venjix call out that there are 10 Red Rangers, which for some reason he instantly knows when they're demorphed. But then we get the more proper group shot where Danny Slavin is very clearly being digitally inserted into, with the lighting on him being vastly different from that of the other Rangers. But then we get to the morphing sequence, which to me, the morphing sequences during team up episodes have always been really great moments. But this one in particular is just epic. Going from one Red Ranger to the next in chronological order, each having their own unique morphing call and later shouting out their Ranger designations, and yet really embracing the history of the show, which will always be a special moment for me, though finally there is a bit of an error with Leo and Wes, with them not doing the roll call properly, but again, I can ignore that here. And it would have been cool if they did also incorporate the theme songs with each of these morphs, mixing in the 10 different theme songs, though obviously that would have been a difficult task and would have made it a bit jarring, so I get why they didn't do it here, though it would have been a nice little touch. But then we do have the standard explosion behind the Rangers after they morph, which is kind of dumb, but again, that's Power Rangers for you. And really for me, this is just an epic moment from my point of view. And we do follow this up with another really fantastic series of fight sequences, where the Morph Rangers now take on the Generals in groups of 2, being paired up. We do start with Cole and Jason taking on Venjix in a sequence where we see a lot of wire work, which does lead to some cool maneuvers from Jason. That leads to Cole saying more phenomenal. Obviously another callback there. But this sequence does really highlight Jason as his mentor figure for Cole here. We then have Tommy and Wes's fight, with this fight having some Matrix-esque visual effects from Tommy, leading to him pulling off the finishing blow. We then have Eric and Aruko's fight, with Aruko avoiding the attacks with his quick speed, followed by their enemies starting an avalanche, which has them flipping their way down a hill that looks ridiculous, but Eric ends up defeating the General with his Quantum Defender, which to me was probably the most underwhelming of the fight sequences here. Then we have Leo and TJ both dual wielding during their fight sequence, where we do see them having a sliver of trouble here, but out of the smoke we see Leo uppercut the General while jumping into the sky, while TJ finishes off the General with a move similar to that of the Turbo Megazord's finisher. And finally, we have Andros and Carter, with this fight revolving around them using their blasters, again highlighting Carter's specialty. And this sequence does have this speed up, slow down effect that was really cool visually and kind of ahead of its time. But again, they anticlimactically finish this General off by just shooting him off a cliff. But then we cut back to Cole, where he uses his Crystal Saber to damage Venjix before Venjix is able to escape to Serpentera and activate it, which, by the way, looks terrible. And all the CGI in this episode is pretty terrible. But again, it's Power Rangers from the early 2000s, so what do you expect? But also budgetary issues played a factor in that. But Serpentera starts to take off for Earth, And this is where we get the biggest knock against the episode in my eyes, which is how they conclude the conflict here, where for this grand event of taking down Serpentera, you would expect something cool to happen here, like all the previous Megazords coming back to take it down, which obviously they didn't have the budget for, or maybe using the Battleizers or powered up forms to have them work together to take it down. But no, instead, we have Cole declaring that there's only one chance, and that is the Wild Force Rider, a motorcycle just given to Cole in the previous episode, and he decides to ride it directly into Serpentera's mouth, destroying it and Venjix along with it, and the other Rangers end up cheering for him, with Jason saying, "You did well, rookie," which is a nice payoff to the Jason-Cole relationship, but everything else here is really terrible. Not only is this extremely rushed, taking down the strongest Zord in history in an instant, it's also defeated by Cole with no one else's help. But also, it's a dumb motorcycle that he's riding through space that ends up defeating Serpentera. All of this so dumb. But knowing about the production of this episode, it was a necessity for this episode to even exist. Where, as I mentioned before, production ran out of money before finishing the episode, leading to them having to find another way to pay for the rest of the episode, which led to them making a deal with Bandai to where they would pay for the remaining costs as long as they were able to promote a brand new toy, that being the Wild Force Rider. So again, really underwhelming that this is how this all-time great episode ends up having to conclude, but if it wasn't for this deal being made, we probably wouldn't have had an episode at all. So while this is a massive negative for the episode, it obviously ends up being a necessity and is one that doesn't take away from the greatness that happens throughout the rest of the episode. But the episode does conclude with another great scene of the Rangers back on Earth with Leo there for some reason, again still being digitally inserted into the scene, while Aurico isn't there, which makes you question where did Aurico go, considering Aurico came in with Leo. Again, makes no sense. And outside of this scene being a farewell to the actors that came back for this episode, I really don't get why they bothered to insert Leo into this scene, as it really just makes for more inconsistencies where we have Tommy thanking the Rangers and bids them farewell, but before they do, they make a circle with their fist, except for Leo's, who's not there, only for him to be there in the other shots of the scene. So again, that's weird. But we have this fun ending of Tommy walking away and Cole saying he really is the greatest Ranger ever, leading to the others each having a one-liner trying to one-up each other, each one making a reference to their previous seasons, though this scene was heavily edited down from the original. And also I do find it funny how Andros' original line here was him bragging about him being the one to kill Zordon, which was obviously later changed as expected, considering that's pretty out of character for Andros to be bragging about that as a reason why he's the best Ranger. But the episode does end with this kind of dumb line of TJ bringing up the episode of him being baked in a pizza, leading to the others shooing him off as if they've heard the story a billion times. Again, a nice little ending scene filled with references to previous seasons, as you would expect from an anniversary episode. But there we go. I mean, that's the entire episode of Forever Red, one of my personal favorite episodes of Power Rangers ever, and probably the episode in TV history that I have the most nostalgia for. Being a near perfect anniversary episode for Power Rangers, that the greatest flaws of it, again, stem from its very rocky production. But I have so much respect for how this episode was constructed and how they were able to cram in so many little references to previous seasons as they could have, and obviously allow us to see the return of almost every Red Ranger up until this point, most of which are some of my all-time favorite Power Ranger characters. So again, I do adore this episode despite its flaws, obviously to the point where I felt obligated to make this extensive video here. But those are my thoughts on Forever Red. Now moving forward, I'm not entirely sure how often I'll be doing Power Ranger related videos. Again, to me, this was a very special episode to me where I felt like I needed to go out of my way to make it. Though with next year being the 30th anniversary of Power Rangers, I have thought about doing some sort of video on Mighty Morphin Season 1, but I wouldn't lock that in just yet. However, I also would love to sometime next year getting around to doing my Power Ranger season ranking, which would require me to refresh myself on the series and watch from Ninja Steel on for the first time, but I would like to try to get that video done at some point next year, so hopefully stay tuned for that. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.